the sexism of poverty? Do they have access to the healthcare they need, to the education they need? Because music itself is a practice.
When we're vulnerable, it's actually a gift to other people.
Full-on loving jokes about flatulence.
I light up when I hear you say that. Hello and welcome to Integral Yoga Podcast. Today I'm so happy to be joined by a member of HuDost. And a little bit about HuDost. They function as a duo or as a band. HuDost core musicians are Moksha Sommer and Jemal Wade-Hines. And today I'm joined by Moksha. And HuDost have been fortunate to have incredible performance opportunities throughout the years and have toured internationally since 2006, collaborating with wild, astonishing, and respected artists, musicians, dancers, and activists. And they've come to Yogaville a few times to perform here as well and are involved in the integral yoga community. So Moksha, thanks so much for being here today. I want to start by asking you about just how you discovered integral yoga and how that relationship unfolded for you.
That's a great question. Well, our first introduction was actually through the IYI that's in New York City. We played there many times when we were living up there, and really kind of through that came to know some of the essential teachings. It was like one of those sneaky things where we thought we were playing a normal yoga center and then discovered much more in the process. And, it was interesting because, a lot of our sort of more spiritual training is through the lineage of Hazrat Inayat Khan, Sufi mystic who brought Sufism to the West. And, one of his core teachings was the universal worship, which was essentially a ceremony honoring all faiths and trying to give equal homage to all faiths, and the power of bringing together the shared message while still honoring the separate ways and expressions of that message. And, that's a lot of what we kind of discovered in what was being presented through IYI. And at a certain point, we moved down to the South. We lived near Nashville in Kentucky, as we talked about earlier, and have been a few times to where you are. And it's a really beautiful and powerful place. And, that's that very thing that comes through, is that sense of inclusion and what has come from the teachings that were given and that continue to be empowered through the work that's happening now. So
I know you do a lot of work as an activist. Is this message that you were just describing about many traditions and honoring them and seeing the universal truth of the message, is that a part of the activism that you're a part of the message that you try to kind of send out to the world about more of kind of accepting and being inclusive of everyone?
In a sense, yes. I mean, I think we're actually active in a few different areas, and interfaith work has always been important to us. But, through the years, one of the things that we've learned, like the more sort of social action we've done, the more we've realized that, one of the biggest issues is not necessarily in what distinguishes us in terms of beliefs or where we are from or those type of things, so much honestly as economic divisions. And so we continue to want to do interfaith work, but where our focus has been for the last 7 years, about 7 years ago, we became congressional district representatives for the nonprofit One. And the main aim with that is working to end extreme poverty. And, through that time, we've learned a great deal about what that even means, how that plays out. That's really like the biggest, that's the biggest sort of dividing factor that happens in terms of how people's lives can take shape and what their capacity even is like from day one, do they have access to the healthcare they need? Do they have access to the education they need? And we've done a lot through one. In the last years, especially, there's been a lot of looking at some of the sexism of poverty, especially in places of extreme poverty where males are given priority in terms of having access to education. Females are automatically assumed that they will simply be the ones keeping everything going in terms of, feeding the people and having children, et cetera, et cetera. And, that's sort of a whole thing to delve into. But I mean, it's really interesting from our perspective. It's like what we don't realize in the West is how much of an impact we have with our voices in relation to people who are not heard because of where they live and how they live. And, just in the U.S. alone, there's a huge budget that is simply already there. It doesn't have to be worked for. It's simply there in terms of helping people in other places who are living in extreme poverty. And what is needed often is simply guidance of how that budget is used. And so that's a big part of what we've done is we have meetings with different congressmen and senators. And being in Kentucky, being the Kentucky reps, we meet with Rand Paul and Mitch McConnell and Brett Guthrie and others, and essentially guide them in terms of the most effective ways they can use that budget to help people who are, hurting the most with it. In the last year, there's been so much in relation to COVID. I mean, if we look at what's happening, especially in India and Africa now, it's so painful to look at that from an honest perspective and not looking away when we see what's happening. And so we've been in the last months behind the whole push to actually make it so vaccines are accessible to those places. And it's just in the last couple of days that actually Biden has approved, I think I forget the number of doses, but I think it's a huge number that he just approved will be actually going to especially India and Africa to help with what's happening right now. So that's a little bit of a long-winded answer to your question. But in short, I mean, in terms of working to end extreme poverty, basically it's not just one method. It's basically looking at it and continuously revising. Like when we first started, we did a whole thing to be able to bring sustainable electricity to Africa so that schools and hospitals and that kind of thing could have even the ability to just like refrigerate vaccines and make it safer, make students be able to see and make it so that there were street lights in places where there was more violence so that kids could get home safely from school, right? And that was approved and that's been moved forward with. And then there's been a big push around education and now helping in terms of the health crisis. So it's really interesting, but it becomes adaptive, in terms of, and I think that's what we have to do in general is like not focus on the method or the approach in terms of what we're doing, but focus on what the problem is and then how we can help that.
So why do you do this? Why do you choose to spend your time trying to help out in these ways?
That's a good question. I've been drawn to it since I was a kid. I think it helped to have parents who were conscious about this stuff. I mean, it wasn't in the same way. My parents were environmental activists in terms of land conservation, which still means a great deal to me. But I grew up with some of that in my mind. And then, like even in high school, I was the president of the Human and Animal Rights Club at school, right? So we were doing fundraising. I mean, I've always just been, I think it's really important for especially kids to understand how privileged we are, um, and to understand that not all beings have that privilege, and that it's not just that we're lucky, it's that we also have a certain amount of responsibility with that. So that's like my innate moral compass with this. That said, especially like when we were first doing music full time, I had graduated university, and there were several years where we were just like 100% in the music. And part of me was like telling myself, well, this is positive work in the world. This is work that fosters healing for people, etc. And I still completely believe that. I mean, I think music and the arts are like the biggest healing tool that can exist. But I also felt I realized I was getting cynical with what that change was. And I realized that it felt narcissistic to think that just my music was a big enough healing tool for what the need was out there. And so we just felt this drive to do more hands-on work with it. And interestingly, like when we first wanted to do that, I thought it would be like really hands-on. I was just like, I'll just volunteer in an animal shelter or something. And the more we did it, the more we kept being asked to be the ones doing meetings with the congressmen and senators. And we were being asked to also like help encourage people through our music. So using the stage as a platform to get other people involved in things like letter writing and making calls to leaders and that kind of thing. So it was interesting because it just sort of slowly did this interesting thing where it turned around and became part of what we do through music, using music as a tool for that very thing. So that's sort of it was an interesting journey to discover, because I think every one of us can be in service, but how that service takes shape is really different. And different people have different strengths with how they can be of service. So,
yeah. One thing I'm really interested in is like, how can this change? Can this work unfold? Like really, like on a psychological aspect for a human being? Because what I notice is that people don't really like to be told what to do so much, right? Like even when you resonate with it and it makes a lot of sense, like, okay, this is the work that needs to be done and we need people to do it. And so go ahead and do it. That doesn't seem to be as effective as kind of what I just heard you say a little bit, is that diving internally, maybe asking the question, what do I want to do with my time and my life? And then from that question arises a certain passion, a fire that is a lot stronger, right, than it would be just if like you're kind of obeying what someone else is saying for you to do, right?
Yeah. I mean, people who volunteer in a soup kitchen a couple hours every week, that's just as important, if not more important, than how I'm doing it. This is just how I can do it because it's what I'm most effective with, And I think that's like, but we have to ask ourselves, like, how can I do this and how do I want to do this? Because the reality is, like, everyone I know who does any kind of service work ends up feeling, no matter how much work it is, ends up feeling like it's actually nourishing for them. And I feel that, like there are sometimes I walk away from this and I'm like, wow, I feel really good right now. Like, I feel like this is feeding me. And, it's fed me creatively too. And, just even just some of the musical collaborations that we've had in the last years, and partnering with nonprofits in terms of the music we do, like it's been a joyous thing for me too. So it feels like, it's not a one-way street with any of this. And in terms of getting people involved, I like to make it fun and simple for people. So, for example, like, let's say there's a bill we want to have passed in Congress, right? we can play a festival and we can have people right there at a table on the festival grounds with paper and guidelines ready. And from the stage, we can share, like, what is this bill? Why does it matter? What will it accomplish? Now you have the chance. You don't have to give money. Just go write a letter right there, and then people will be like, oh, I can do that. I can do, you know what I mean? So I'm like, I don't know. I think a lot of people have this block where they feel it's going to be this whole big deal to do service work. And so I like to be like, no, just have fun, and you get a sticker in the process, or something like that. So
it's so key. It's so key, especially I think in this world today where we're like totally inundated with information and it's hard to keep up with. And we want to do these things, but we kind of need to have our hands held and also have it be fun, right? But like what you said, like make it really, really simple. Is key. Yeah.
And, in the truth behind it too is like, if we weren't given, like, it's all about collective action. It's all about like what we can do as teams, as groups on behalf of other people, because there's no way we could be the ones like doing everything in terms of writing the bills and, like doing every single step in the process. We're working with other people who are brilliant at those skill sets, and then we get to just read the bill and understand it and present it, So I think like that's the thing is there doesn't have to be loneliness in any of this. Real service is about coming together with other people. And, like that's one of the biggest things I've learned through music too. One of the biggest joys that I have through music is collaborating with other musicians and discovering and learning with them and, feeling like it's so much more powerful in that way than it could be alone.
Right. I have I light up when I hear you say that too, because to me, like being a part of a team that's focused on something, a common goal that is not getting caught very much in this whole ego, lower self type of thing. It's like, that's how I want to spend my time, like being a part of a team. We're not competing, comparing against each other. We're just using what we've been given, the gifts that we've been given towards accomplishing something that feels right to us.
Yeah. Yeah. It's pretty amazing. And I mean, it's interesting, but I look back at especially sort of my first years as an independent musician. And I mean, it's not true of like my training, because a lot of my training, I have just sort of like classical training in terms of piano and that kind of stuff. But in my teens, even I started to tour with choirs, and that, talk about a like amazing group experience, right? Like that's such a powerful thing to be immersed in. But then breaking away and becoming my own songwriter, my own musician, and on that path, I look back at like there were a few years where there was this definite ego battle, whether it was the thing of like I'm not good enough, or oh, I'm too good to be collaborating with so and so. You know what I mean? It was just this like, this like turbulent ego battle that I had to move through. And, it was in exactly the right time of my life too, right? Like late teens, early 20s, right in there. And then something broke through with it where it was like, first of all, I think it was partly just that I felt like I was established enough on my own, and I believed in my own creative self enough to do it. But it was also this thing of like, oh my gosh, there's this beautiful surrender when you can just like empower other people too and be part of that together, and it not have to be a competition in any way. If anything, it's more just a like, wow, you're awesome. Let's do this. Like, let's see what we can do together. And, speaking of advocacy work and that kind of thing, especially, it was through advocacy work that we met the lead singer of Jars of Clay, if you know that band, because we were both in D.C. Doing advocacy work. He was there for his nonprofit Bloodwater, which is based here in Nashville, and we were there with One, which I mentioned. And we were actually working on similar bills, and we didn't know who he was. We didn't know he was a musician, but we had this sort of dinner all together after a long day of going into all the different offices of different senators and congressmen, and he gave just a little talk about advocacy, and I was really moved. I mean, I remember, like, there was it had been a long day, it had been a lot, it had been a learning, but what his words were about that very thing of collective action. And I just, I remember crying as he spoke. And we connected with him around that, and then discovered who he was as a musician. And we're like, oh crap, excuse the language, but he's an incredibly talented and interesting musician. And he sort of investigated us musically too, and felt the same way. And so we started to actually work together. And ever since then, we've worked with him a fair bit and the rest of the guys from Jars of Clay. And they all do, I mean, they're really fueled by service work too. And they do a lot of this. And some of the songwriting that we've done together has been a really amazing process for me, because it's that thing of like, the egos aren't there. Like, it's not, there's no one trying to prove anything, but everybody giving their all with it. And it's really amazing when that happens, and that's, to me, that's the work of like, the dedicated, humble musician warrior, where it's that thing of like, it's not who cares, what matters is not necessarily me. What matters is what comes from this. Like, what is it? Because that really and truly is a higher power and a bigger entity than any of us as individuals. And so it's been a really cool growth and learning for me in terms of doing some of that. And our new album that's coming out this year, almost all the guys from Jars play on it. It was produced by one of the other members. And like, those are the people we've been like potted with in the studio for the last year or two. So yeah, it's really special when that happens.
Just thinking about the title of their band name, Jars of Clay. Why do you think they chose that name?
I have been told, and I've completely forgotten, so I would have to look it up again.
Well, what about your name? What about HuDost? Why that name?
HuDost, who is, in all the Abrahamic faiths, who is the breath, the sort of like, it's sort of like an interesting, it's like the silent sound of the divine, of the one being, right? So but it's that breath. It's almost like the sort of like Turkish and Abrahamic Om, where it's that shared breath and sound. And dost means true friend. So it's the true friend of the divine breath and sound.
Mm. Wow. Yeah. That's
We're
powerful.
We're working on it.
We're working on it. Wow. Are you having fun doing what you're doing, living?
Oh, heck yeah. Well, I love music so much. Honestly, the last little bit has been this like reorientation, because being not playing any shows in person for over a year because of COVID was like an unexpected sabbatical. And we haven't had that long of no shows since, before 2006. Actually, like, I think back and I'm like, I don't think I've had that long since I was like 14 or something. I've always had performance since then. So it's kind of, it was really different way of being. And we certainly didn't stop in terms of playing music. I mean, we wrote a whole album, did another album of cover songs. We did an entire soundtrack for an interdisciplinary dance and video piece. Like we were very busy in terms of playing music, but doing it in the studio is really different from being in person and in that performance space. And it was not last weekend, but the weekend before, we had our first real re-entry performance, which was a sold out concert that was hosted by like one of the Florida NPR stations. And we made it through everything. We did it. And I mean, being in that space was really beautiful to like re-enter, but we also it felt like this. And I mean, I haven't had anxiety about performing in a really long time. And there was some of that just because I was like, wow, I feel like I've been in retreat mode this whole time, and this is a completely different space. So next week, we leave for like a real run of dates in New York and Vermont. And I'm a little bit more geared up for it because of having that re-entry recently, but it's just sort of interesting to witness like the energy shift that's needed to do that while staying grounded and calm and, in that place. So I do love it. I do have fun. Performing is really fun. Performing with the full band at festivals is always really fun. And we won't do that until the fall just because of, COVID restrictions and stuff. But I have to I feel like I'm still partially in retreat mode. So I need to, I need to gracefully, if I can, move into real world experience.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about practice. Something I've been thinking about a lot more and more recently, just getting clear, really. I mean, I know we say it always that, you get better when you practice, obviously, but just like the truth of it, right? And especially in terms of beginner's mind, when you first take a step in a new direction, to remember that, okay, I'm just starting out here. Like I need to put in the hours, essentially. And if I do, it's going to be a very different experience than it feels like now. So I'm just curious if that's been your experience with practice and, putting yourself out there and doing new things, and watching that process continue as you get more comfortable. What have you come to learn about practicing?
Well, I think any kind of practice, whether we're looking at spiritual practice or musical practice or, yogic physical practice, what it really comes down to is doing it so much that you end up with muscle memory for it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And, even with like performing, so that very thing of like, as soon as we were back on the stage doing it, it was like, okay, yes, I know this. This is right. Like it's a literal muscle memory for me. And I mean, the same thing is true with any of those things, but it really takes, the word practice is there for a reason. You do it over and over and over until it becomes really part of the fabric of who you are. And of course, we all know that like getting used to any kind of practice is the hardest part. It's like establishing it, making it where it's really part of your almost like DNA, like it's part of the patterning of who you are. But once it becomes that, it's really special because then there's so much more ease with it too. And I think there's a lot more forgiveness when you know from deep in yourself what the practice is, because there's less preciousness around it too, because it just is. So I hope that makes sense in terms of, what you meant with it. But I'll also share that, when I first, playing music is an interesting thing because music itself is a practice, and it can be a very private practice, a very deep inner practice. And then performing music is a different one. And when I first started performing music, I would get a lot of anxiety. And, it was again a real ego training because I had to basically through practice train my body and self and voice to allow like a bigger power to come through and to not be in the way, and for it not to need to be this like back and forth, but simply just sort of being a channel for it. And I think I've experienced that in terms of other forms of practice too, where it's really just it's like cleaning, It's like if our windows get too foggy, the light doesn't come through as well. And the practice is not necessarily the action itself so much as like keeping it clean, and keeping the channels nice and clear and, not too many cobwebs and, not too many hurdles and, and so, in terms of that, what I was sharing is like, that's how it started for me, was that thing of anxiety and performing. And it was this whole like back and forth thing. And then when I discovered how to like train my own ego and just be and just let it come through, there suddenly too was much more humor about it and much more joy in the process. And when mistakes, there was like a tipping point. I wish I could look back and go, oh, it was then, but I don't know. I don't know when exactly it happened, but I now, like for many years now, it's like if mistakes are made, just laugh. It's okay. Move on. And the fact is, like, the crowd responds more to that than they would to what the mistake was. I used to like beat myself up when a mistake was made. And we're not just talking about on the musical performance front. We're talking about like, in spiritual practice or whatever. Like if there was a mistake made, I would be like, oh, so angry at myself, and like beat myself up over it. And then there was that tipping point and I'm just like, oh, that's funny. Look at what just happened, and I can just, it just becomes part of like the deeper understanding of it. And there has to be humor with it. And so now, like, for example, at that show a couple weeks ago, we started one song like literally twice the speed that it should have been played. And we were just like, oh my gosh, we have to stop. Just hang on, just stop. And, with the crowd, I was just like, you know what, y'all, this is our first real in-person show. Like, we are special with you today. Can we back up and do this? And, they just laughed and it was fine. It was, great because other people have empathy and people are going through the same stuff. So it just takes different forms with it. So the more we're able to just laugh, the more people will join the train,
Yes. What I'm learning more and more is that when we're vulnerable, it's actually a gift to other people.
Yeah. It's a gift, and we don't have to have shame about vulnerability. Yeah. And that's the biggest thing, is not feeling apologetic about vulnerability.
It's like what you were mentioning before in terms of cleanliness. And I think that this is really the point of all spiritual practices is getting clean. What does it mean to be a clean instrument? So.
Yeah. And I think that there has to be a lot of forgiveness in the process. If we look at a lot of the different spiritual teachers who've offered amazing work, there's a lot of messiness there too. And, in terms of our own spiritual seeking, we've definitely had some like shattering of ideals in terms of, because of the messiness of teachers coming out. And I think that can be like a point where I think most people I know on the spiritual path have had this at one point or another, whether it's with something really small in terms of how a teacher is, or whether it's something really big. And I think we can kind of become angry and cynical with it, or we can just simply acknowledge the delicacy of people, the fragility of people, the imperfection of people, and again, have humor in the process,
Thank you for that. I'm starting to look for opportunities to laugh in my day more and more. really believing in what you're saying. It's just like, it's so healing. It changes everything. And it feels appropriate to be laughing. It really does.
I have a 7-year-old little boy too. So there has to be like, if I get too serious, that's when things start becoming problematic, you know? So.
So how it is. I've got a 2-year-old little girl, and
there you go. It'll just get more so. I promise. He's like definitely at the like full-on loving jokes about flatulence right now, and I don't. So.
Amazing. All right, Moksha, thank you so much for this time.
Thank you.
We're going to end. I'm so happy to be offering a piece of your music called "Come Home." Before we move into that, again, I want to say thank you because we'll end with that. But is there anything about this piece of music that you'd like to share?
Sure. Just that it, it was written in this time in the last year with everything happening with COVID. I can just push our pre-sale for a moment. Our album is going to come out at the end of November, and this is the album that we've written through this whole time of basically being on retreat. And the album itself is called Anthems of Home. If you want to do the pre-sale, that's awesome because that helps us do the final steps in terms of getting the album out there, and you would get the album and or whatever cool package you pick in August as opposed to November. So you'd get it way early, and everything is on our website. I'm sure you can share that information. But as I said, the whole album is called Anthems of Home. And, I think we were all, the last year and a half has been a time, as I've said, of like imposed retreat, and definitely a looking at whatever we need to look at in that time. We were, as we already have said, like all of our performances were put on hold. We were supposed to be touring in Africa and in Europe and various places. And all of that was just pushed to the side. We were suddenly homeschooling our son, and neither of us have any skill teaching a 7-year-old in terms of that, And so we were I think everyone was having to be a little bit uncomfortable. And the question was, were we able to come to a place of like love and presence through that? Or was it more challenging than that? Were there losses, were there gains? What came of this? And, I'm grateful to say that like the love of our family deepened even through this. So while it was not always easy, it really put us to the test in terms of how we could rise to this. And the song Come Home is about that very thing of like departing from home and returning to home, and what that means is a bigger metaphor. Home as self, home as family, home as community. So that's what this song is about.
Love it. Yes, and we'll put all the information in the show notes, so feel free to look there and follow up with HuDost. Moksha, thank you so much again for this time, and thank you for being you.
Thank you for being you. This was a wonderful conversation.
All right, everyone, enjoy Come Home. Until next time.
You back to the source I knew. Perhaps you'll follow me back to the land, back to our dream. Oh, I will see with you. The journey's more wondrous without a map. I will grow with you. The tears of our laughter, a joyous mishap. Run away with me in the wake of this vision. In a world it seems on a course of collision. Why does it always come back to this place? A mirror held up to my face, and I need to come home. Need to come
Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this content and think others might as well, please feel free to share and subscribe.